Nobody thinks they are the narcissist. That is the first and most important thing to understand about this subject. In every relationship where narcissism is causing damage, in every dynamic where one person is consuming the emotional resources of everyone around them while giving almost nothing back, the person doing the consuming has a perfectly coherent explanation for why their behavior is reasonable, why they deserve what they are taking, why the people around them are the problem, why their needs are simply larger and more legitimate than other people's needs, and why anyone who suggests otherwise is being unfair. This is not a performance. This is not strategic deception, at least not in the conscious, deliberate sense. It is something more fundamental and more difficult to address than simple dishonesty. It is a particular structure of self, a particular way of relating to one's own interior life and to other people that produces these patterns automatically and with what feels, from the inside, like complete justification. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the problem of the self. Not the self in the simple everyday sense of personality or identity, but the self as a psychological structure, the way a person is organized internally, the relationship between what they show the world and what is actually operating underneath. And what he found when he examined the patterns we now recognize as narcissistic was something that went considerably deeper than vanity or selfishness or an inflated opinion of oneself. What he found was a particular kind of wound, and understanding that wound, how it forms, how it defends itself, and what it costs the person carrying it, as well as everyone around them, changes the way you see this subject entirely, not in a way that excuses the damage narcissism causes. The damage is real and it deserves to be named clearly, but in a way that makes the whole phenomenon comprehensible rather than simply baffling or enraging. This is that explanation. The first thing to understand is what narcissism actually is and what it is not. The word gets used loosely now. Someone posts too many photographs of themselves and they are called a narcissist. Someone is confident in a way that reads as arrogance and they are called a narcissist. Someone prioritizes their own needs in a particular situation and they are called a narcissist. And while extreme self-involvement is part of what clinical narcissism involves, the casual use of the term misses what is actually happening at the psychological level and why it matters. Psychologists distinguish between narcissism as a personality trait that exists on a spectrum and narcissistic personality disorder, which is the more extreme and more structurally entrenched form. As a trait, narcissism includes an inflated sense of one's own importance, a tendency to overestimate one's abilities and attractiveness, a need for attention and admiration, and a reduced capacity for genuine empathy. Most people have some of these qualities to some degree. The question is always one of degree and rigidity. How much of the person's life is organized around these patterns, and how available are those patterns to change? Jung would add something to this description that clinical psychology sometimes understates. He would point out that the inflated self-image is not the underlying reality. It is a defense against an underlying reality. The grandiosity, the entitlement, the need for constant admiration, these are not expressions of genuine self-confidence. They are substitutes for it. And the difference between a defense and the thing it is defending against is everything when you are trying to understand why narcissistic patterns are so resistant to change. There are also two forms worth distinguishing because they look quite different on the surface. The first is what researchers call grandiose narcissism. This is the familiar version. Extroverted, dominant, seeking the spotlight, comfortable with attention, drawn to status and positions of influence. The grandiose narcissist is often charismatic. They can be compelling to be around, at least initially, because their self-assurance reads as genuine, and their appetite for attention creates a kind of magnetic field. People are drawn in before they understand what the dynamic actually costs. The second form is called vulnerable narcissism, and it is considerably less visible. The vulnerable narcissist is often quiet, even self-effacing on the surface. But underneath the surface, there is the same fundamental structure. the same profound sense of entitlement, the same fragile relationship to criticism, the same reduced capacity for genuine empathy, the same need to be seen as special, though it may express itself through victimhood or suffering rather than through dominance. The difference is in the presentation, not in the underlying psychology. Jung would recognize both forms as expressions of the same core problem, a self that has not been able to develop the internal stability that comes from genuine self-knowledge, a self that is organized around maintaining a particular image rather than around the actual, complex, imperfect reality of who the person actually is. The second thing to understand is where this structure comes from. Jung was always interested in origins, not in a way that removed accountability from people for their behavior, but in a way that made the behavior intelligible. And the origins of narcissistic structure, in his framework, are almost always legible once you know what you are looking for. He would point first to the developmental environment, the relationship between the early self and the people responsible for reflecting that self back. Because here is something that does not get discussed enough in popular accounts of narcissism. The self does not arrive already knowing what it is. It discovers what it is through the experience of being seen. A child who is consistently seen accurately, whose real qualities are recognized and reflected back, whose emotions are taken seriously, whose limitations are acknowledged without cruelty, and whose genuine self is experienced as lovable, develops something sturdy. An internal sense of self that does not require constant external validation to feel real. But a child whose early environment does not provide that accurate reflection develops something different. And there are two primary ways that accurate reflection fails. The first is the environment that reflects the child as more than they are, where they are placed on a pedestal, treated as exceptional and special in ways that are not grounded in reality, where their needs are always primary and their shortcomings are never honestly acknowledged. This environment does not teach the child to know themselves. It teaches them to inhabit an inflated image of themselves, and because that image is not grounded in the actual self, it requires constant external confirmation to feel stable. This is the developmental pathway that researchers associate with grandiose narcissism. The second environment is in some ways the opposite: cold, critical, controlling. A place where the child's genuine self is not welcome, where emotional needs are dismissed or punished, where love feels conditional on performance, and where the child learns that their real interior, their actual feelings and needs and imperfections, is not acceptable. This child also learns to maintain a particular image, but the image is organized around survival rather than grandiosity, around not being too much, being whatever is required, finding ways to be seen as special enough to earn the love that was never freely given. This is the developmental pathway associated with vulnerable narcissism. Jung would describe both of these outcomes in terms of the persona, the mask, and its relationship to the shadow, the parts of the self that have been pushed outside the boundary of acceptable identity. In narcissistic development, the persona becomes unusually rigid and unusually necessary. The gap between the presented self and the actual self becomes unusually wide. And what falls into the shadow, what gets pushed underground because it cannot be integrated into the image that is being maintained, is precisely the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the genuine humanness that would make authentic connection possible. The tragedy Jung saw in this, and it is a genuine tragedy even though the patterns cause real harm, is that the very structure designed to protect the self from further wounding is the structure that prevents the self from ever receiving what it most needs: real recognition, real connection, the experience of being genuinely known rather than simply admired. The third thing to understand is what empathy looks like in this structure, and why its absence is not simply selfishness. One of the defining features of narcissistic psychology, and one of the most painful for the people in relationship with narcissistic individuals, is the reduced capacity for genuine empathy, the inability to fully enter another person's experience, to recognize their needs as real and legitimate, to feel the impact of one's own behavior on them in a way that produces any significant internal response. This is often interpreted as not caring, as deliberate indifference, as the narcissist simply not valuing other people enough to concern themselves with what those people feel. And sometimes there is something close to that operating, particularly in more severe presentations. But Jung would offer a more precise description. The issue is not primarily one of caring versus not caring, it is one of access. The narcissistic structure requires a very particular relationship to the self, one in which the internal world is organized around maintaining the image. Genuine empathy requires temporarily suspending that self-focus, stepping into someone else's reality, letting their experience land, allowing it to matter. And for someone whose psychological stability depends on keeping their own internal image intact and protected, that kind of stepping out is genuinely threatening. Not in a way they can necessarily articulate, but in a way that produces automatic resistance. This does not mean that narcissistic individuals never feel anything for others. Many of them do, in their way. But the feeling tends to be mediated through the self in a particular way. They can feel for someone whose suffering confirms something they believe about themselves, whose need for help allows them to experience themselves as generous or important. They can feel for someone when the other person's experience is close enough to their own that it functions as a kind of mirror. But the capacity to feel for someone in a way that is genuinely about that person, that does not require the narcissist's own image to be implicated in a favorable way, is limited in proportion to the severity of the narcissistic structure. Jung saw this as directly connected to the shadow problem. Genuine empathy requires a degree of psychological integration, the ability to recognize in yourself the full range of human experience, including vulnerability, limitation, need, and failure. That recognition makes it possible to recognize those things in others and to meet them there. But the narcissistic structure has pushed all of that into the shadow, refused it, kept it outside the boundary of acceptable selfhood. And what you have refused to know about yourself, you cannot truly recognize in others. The fourth thing to understand is what this costs the narcissist themselves. This is the dimension that almost never gets discussed, because when we are talking about narcissism, we are usually talking about it from the perspective of the people who have been hurt by it. And that is a legitimate and important perspective. The damage that narcissistic patterns cause in relationships, in families, in organizations, is real and sometimes severe, and deserves to be taken seriously. But Jung would insist that you cannot fully understand what you are dealing with unless you also understand what the narcissistic structure costs the person inside it, because the cost is significant, and understanding it does not require you to excuse the behavior. It simply requires you to see the whole picture. The fundamental cost is this: the narcissistic person never gets to know themselves. They live their entire life inside the performance of an image rather than inside the reality of an actual self. And the gap between those two things produces a particular kind of interior emptiness that the constant pursuit of admiration is trying to fill, but never can. Because admiration, even when it arrives in abundance, is always directed at the image, not at the self underneath. And some part of the person knows this, even if they cannot articulate it, even if they have no conscious access to the knowledge. The praise lands, but does not nourish. The admiration confirms the image, but leaves the self untouched. And so the hunger continues. Jung would also point to what he called the inflation problem. When the self is organized around an inflated image, the image must be perpetually maintained and defended. Every interaction becomes, at some level, an evaluation. Every relationship contains the implicit question of whether this person confirms or threatens the image. And when something threatens it, when someone fails to respond with the expected admiration, when criticism arrives that cannot be dismissed, when reality asserts itself in a way that contradicts the grandiose self-presentation, the response is disproportionate. Not because the narcissist is choosing to be disproportionate, but because at the level of their psychology, what is being threatened feels existential. The image is not just something they have. In the absence of a grounded self, it is everything they are, and its disruption feels like annihilation. This is exhausting to live inside, and it produces a kind of brittleness, a perpetual vigilance against threat, a relational life organized around management rather than connection that is, in its own way, a kind of suffering, different from the suffering of the people around the narcissist, less visible, less sympathetic, often actively generated by the person experiencing it, but real. The fifth thing to understand is whether and how this changes. This is where Jung's perspective becomes particularly important and particularly honest. Because the popular answer to whether narcissists can change tends to be either optimistic in a way that sets people up for prolonged suffering, or categorically dismissive in a way that closes off possibilities that sometimes exist. Jung's answer was more precise. Narcissistic structure can change, but the conditions required for change are demanding, and the primary obstacle to those conditions is built into the structure itself. What genuine change requires in his framework is the willingness to turn toward the shadow, to begin to acknowledge, honestly and without the defensive maneuvers that the structure has spent decades perfecting, the parts of the self that have been pushed underground, the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the genuine limitations, the ways in which one's own behavior has caused harm, the need that underlies the grandiosity, the fear that underlies the entitlement, that turning toward is painful in a way that is difficult to overstate for someone who has organized their entire psychological life around moving away from exactly these things. It requires tolerating the experience of an interior that is more complex, more imperfect, more genuinely human than the image has permitted. And the motivation to undergo that experience has to come from somewhere internal, from a genuine desire to know oneself and to live differently, because external pressure alone almost never produces it. This is why psychotherapy for narcissistic personality disorder is genuinely difficult and genuinely slow. Not because the person is unteachable, but because the moment the therapeutic process begins to approach the actual self, the structure activates its defenses. The therapist becomes the problem. The approach is wrong. The questions are unfair. The process is not working. And the person who most needs to stay in the discomfort of the work has been shaped by a lifetime of learning to exit that discomfort through whatever means are available. Progress, when it happens, tends to be incremental and non-linear. It tends to require a therapeutic relationship that can survive the testing the narcissistic structure will put it through. And it tends to require the person to have arrived at a point where the cost of the old structure is more vivid and more personal than the protection it offers. Where something has happened, some loss or rupture or consequence that has made the shadow too large to continue ignoring. Jung would not tell you that this is impossible. He saw enough of human transformation to know that the psyche, even when very defended, retains the capacity to move toward wholeness. But he would tell you not to confuse that capacity with the likelihood of its actualization in any particular case. And he would be especially clear on one point: you cannot do this work for someone who has not chosen to do it themselves. Proximity to someone in narcissistic pain does not obligate you to bear the cost of it indefinitely while waiting for a change that may or may not come. What you can do, and what Jung would encourage, is to understand what you are dealing with clearly enough that you can make honest decisions about your own life. To see the structure for what it is, without either demonizing the person inside it or minimizing the real impact of their patterns on you. To extend the kind of clear-eyed compassion that sees someone completely and still knows what you are and are not willing to participate in. That clarity, the ability to see without distorting, to understand without excusing, to feel what is real without either inflating it or denying it, is what Jung considered the basis of any genuine psychological health, in yourself, in your relationships, and in how you navigate the inevitable encounter with the parts of human psychology that are most defended against the truth. Narcissism is not a mystery. It is a comprehensible response to a particular kind of developmental experience, maintained by a structure that is doing its best to protect a self that never learned another way to survive. Understanding that does not require you to accept the damage it produces. It simply requires you to see it clearly. And seeing clearly, in Jung's view, is always the beginning of the only path that is actually worth walking.